For the next 30 days, I'm not going to eat a single fresh meal. No takeout, no home cooking, no fruit picked off a shelf, nothing that has not been freeze-dried, vacuum-sealed, thermostabilized, or rehydrated with hot water from a pouch. Because for the next 30 days, I am eating exactly what astronauts eat on the International Space Station. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand something that most people never think about, which is that eating in space is not just a logistics problem. It is one of the hardest engineering challenges in all of human spaceflight, and living through it for a month taught me things about food, about the body, and about what it actually takes to survive off this planet that I never expected to learn from a grocery bag full of silver pouches. Let's start with why this is even a problem worth solving, because on the surface it seems simple. Humans eat food every day. Why would space be any different? The answer is that almost everything we take for granted about eating breaks down the moment gravity disappears. On Earth, food sits on a plate because gravity holds it there. In microgravity, food floats. Crumbs float. Liquid does not pour. It forms wobbling spheres that drift into the air, into equipment, into someone's eye. A loose crumb of bread is not just annoying on a space station. It is a genuine hazard because it can drift into an air vent, into sensitive electronics, or even into a crew member's respiratory system. This is the actual reason astronauts do not eat bread in space. Instead, they eat tortillas, because a tortilla does not shed crumbs the way a slice of bread does, and that single substitution is one of the cleanest examples of how space food engineering works. It is not about making food taste like space. It is about redesigning ordinary food so it behaves safely in an environment where nothing behaves the way it should. The other major problem is preservation. On Earth, food spoils because of bacteria, moisture, and oxygen. On a space station, you cannot just run to a store when supplies run low. Resupply missions are expensive, infrequent, and limited by cargo weight, so food needs to last for months, sometimes years, without refrigeration, without spoiling, and without losing so much nutritional value that it becomes useless. This is where freeze-drying comes in, and it is genuinely one of the most fascinating food technologies in existence. Freeze-drying works by first freezing a food solid, then placing it in a vacuum chamber where the frozen water inside sublimates directly from ice into vapor, skipping the liquid stage entirely. This removes almost all the moisture from the food while leaving its structure, flavor compounds, and nutrients largely intact. The result is a lightweight, shelf-stable product that can last for years and can be brought back to something close to its original texture just by adding hot water. Freeze-dried strawberries, freeze-dried scrambled eggs, freeze-dried ice cream, all of it works on this exact principle. And once you understand it, opening one of these pouches feels less like eating a snack and more like watching a small piece of food science happen right in your hands. Before I started this challenge, I did my research the way I always do for these videos, and I want to walk you through the actual categories of food that astronauts eat, because NASA and other space agencies classify space food into distinct types, and each type solves a different problem. There is thermostabilized food, which is heat-processed and sealed in pouches similar to military ready-to-eat meals, things like beef brisket or chicken with rice, shelf-stable without refrigeration. There is freeze-dried food, which requires rehydration with hot or cold water, things like scrambled eggs, macaroni and cheese, or the famous freeze-dried ice cream that most people have actually tried at a science museum at some point in their life. There is irradiated food, which is sterilized using radiation to kill bacteria while staying in something closer to its natural moist state, often used for meat products like steak. There is natural form food, snacks like nuts, granola bars, and cookies that require no special processing at all beyond careful packaging. And finally, there is fresh food, a small and precious category, because every so often a resupply capsule delivers a handful of fresh fruit or vegetables to the station. And astronauts have described this moment, biting into a fresh apple or orange after weeks of processed meals, as one of the most emotionally overwhelming experiences of their entire mission, which tells you something important about how much we underestimate the psychological role food plays in our lives until it is taken away. So here is how I structured my own 30-day version of this. I built my daily meals around the same core categories, sourcing freeze-dried and dehydrated meals designed to mimic the astronaut experience as closely as possible, thermostabilized pouch meals for lunch and dinner, freeze-dried breakfast items like eggs and fruit in the morning, tortillas instead of bread for every single sandwich-style meal, and rehydratable drink pouches instead of anything poured from a bottle. No fresh produce unless it came in a preserved or dehydrated form. No fresh dairy. No ice, since astronauts do not have ice on the station at all, because there is no freezer capable of making it in the way we are used to. Every single meal required adding hot water, waiting, kneading the pouch to mix it evenly, and then eating directly from the packaging with a spoon, which sounds simple until you realize how much of the enjoyment of eating actually comes from plating, texture contrast, and temperature variety, all of which disappear almost completely when everything comes from a sealed silver pouch. The first few days were honestly easier than I expected. The novelty carried me. Freeze-dried strawberries were genuinely delicious, crunchy and intensely sweet, almost like a fruit chip. Rehydrated scrambled eggs were passable, a little rubbery but recognizable. The real turning point came around day 6 or 7 when the repetition started to set in. This is something astronauts have talked about extensively in interviews, a phenomenon sometimes called menu fatigue, where even food you initially enjoyed becomes less and less appealing the more often you eat it, simply because the human palate craves variety, and a limited rotating menu, no matter how well designed, cannot fully replace the psychological satisfaction of choosing something completely new. NASA has actually studied this extensively, because astronauts on longer missions have reported eating less over time, not because they were full, but because they had grown tired of the available options, and reduced caloric intake during long missions is a genuine health concern for mission planners. Since astronauts already lose muscle mass and bone density in microgravity, and inadequate nutrition makes that problem significantly worse, something else surprised me around the second week, and this is backed up by real astronaut testimony, which is that food actually tastes different when your senses are altered. Astronauts in microgravity commonly report a phenomenon similar to having a stuffy nose, because bodily fluids shift upward in the body in the absence of gravity, causing mild facial puffiness and congestion that dulls the sense of smell. And since smell makes up the overwhelming majority of what we perceive as flavor, food in space often tastes muted and bland compared to the same food on Earth. This is precisely why space food is intentionally formulated with much stronger seasoning, more acidity, more spice, and bolder flavor profiles than a typical Earth meal, to compensate for the fact that astronauts simply cannot taste subtlety the way they can on the ground. I obviously was not in microgravity during my own challenge, so I did not experience this dulling effect myself. But understanding why space food is seasoned the way it is completely changed how I interpreted the taste of every meal I ate, because dishes that seemed almost aggressively salty or spicy on Earth were clearly engineered for a body that could barely register them. By the third week, the challenge stopped being about taste entirely and became about routine, discipline, and the strange mental weight of having no real choice in what I ate. This is where the experience started to genuinely mirror something astronauts have spoken about publicly, which is that food becomes one of the only sources of comfort and personal agency available during a long mission, and losing variety in that one area can quietly affect mood and morale far more than people expect. Meal times on the space station are actually treated as important social and psychological anchors, moments where the crew gathers, eats together, and maintains some sense of normal daily rhythm despite living in an environment that is anything but normal. Several astronauts have described shared meals as one of the most important bonding rituals aboard the station, and after 3 weeks of eating alone from sealed pouches, I understood exactly why that social element matters so much. Because eating the exact same reconstituted meal by yourself, day after day, starts to feel less like nourishment and more like a task to get through. Hydration was its own separate challenge throughout the entire month. Astronauts do not drink from open cups because liquid does not behave the same way without gravity pulling it downward. So all beverages are consumed through sealed pouches with straws, sipped slowly to avoid the liquid escaping into the cabin. I replicated this by drinking everything: water, rehydrated juice, even coffee substitutes, through sealed pouches for the entire month. And while it sounds like a minor detail, removing the simple act of pouring a drink into an open glass removes a surprising amount of small sensory pleasure from daily life. Another example of how much invisible design goes into something we never consciously think about on Earth. Around day 20, I started digging deeper into where space food technology is actually headed, because this challenge is not just about recreating the past. It connects directly to one of the biggest open problems in the entire push toward Mars. A trip to the International Space Station involves resupply missions every few months, but a mission to Mars could last 2 to 3 years round trip, with no resupply possible at all, which means every single calorie a crew eats for that entire mission has to either be carried from Earth at launch, an enormous weight and cost problem, or grown and produced on site. This is why NASA and other agencies are investing heavily in research on space agriculture, testing plant growth in microgravity aboard the station itself, growing lettuce, radishes, and even chili peppers in specialized growth chambers, and why there is serious ongoing research into 3D printed food, bioregenerative life support systems, and even lab-grown proteins designed specifically for long-duration missions. Understanding my own 30 days of processed, shelf-stable meals gave me a completely different appreciation for how urgent and difficult the fresh food problem becomes the further humanity travels from Earth, because the freeze-dried pouch that solves the problem for a 6-month space station rotation simply does not scale to a 3-year Mars expedition. By the final week of the challenge, something interesting happened that I did not expect going into this. I stopped noticing the food as strange. It had become normal. My body had adjusted to the rhythm of rehydrating meals, the routine of the pouches, the specific rotation of flavors, and honestly, that adaptation is exactly the point, because that is precisely what happens to real astronauts over the course of a mission. The unfamiliar becomes routine, discomfort becomes normal, and the human body and mind prove remarkably capable of adjusting to environments that seemed impossible to tolerate just weeks earlier. That adaptability is arguably one of the most important qualities that makes long-duration spaceflight possible at all, more important in some ways than any single piece of engineering, because no matter how advanced the food system becomes, it is still a human being on the other end of that pouch, adjusting, adapting, and finding a way to make an alien environment feel, eventually, a little bit like home. Looking back on the full 30 days, what stays with me is not the taste of any specific meal. It is the appreciation for how much invisible engineering goes into something as basic as eating breakfast, and how something we do without thinking 3 times a day on Earth becomes, in space, one of the most carefully studied, carefully designed, and quietly essential systems keeping human beings alive and functional hundreds of miles above the planet they came from. Every silver pouch on that station represents decades of food science, nutrition research, and hard lessons learned from earlier missions, and eating my way through a month of it gave me a small, humbling glimpse into just how much has to go right, quietly, in the background, for humans to survive somewhere we were never biologically designed to be. If you want to see more real challenges exploring what it actually takes for humans to live and survive in space, make sure you are subscribed, because we have a lot more of these experiments coming, and you will not want to miss what we test next.